As more and more begin to know the status quo has got to go, they're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
This is the tyranny of socialism. You write, we often hear the claim that our nation is a democracy. That wasn't the vision of the founders. They saw democracy as another form of tyranny. If we've become a democracy, I guarantee you that the founders would be deeply disappointed by our betrayal of their vision.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. If you read the statements by Madison, Jefferson, and Adams, they condemn the idea of democracy. Matter of fact, you don't find the term democracy in any of our founding documents.
And here's going to be the problem for the Fed. As inflation starts to pick up, after they've already paused, and as the economy is weakening, and especially if they've started to cut, right? So, because they may start to cut rates before the inflation numbers really start to get bad. But if they're not really bad before that first rate cut, they're going to get bad after it. And I think all this is probably going to happen, before the 2024 election. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that after I finish talking about this, because there's a lot of political news that has just come out, and I want to get to that. But I think that rather than the Fed fighting inflation, it's going to be the government that tries to fight inflation, but not in any way that's going to work. I think they're going to impose price controls. And that's already happening right now in France. I've been reading these news stories. In fact, I tweeted about one today that the French government has basically forced French supermarkets, right? So right now it's just in the food sector. And maybe it's going to spread to other segments of the economy. But the French government is applying financial pressure to the supermarkets, grocery stores, not only to stop raising prices, but to actually cut them. And I think prices are going to be cut maybe 2 to 8%, something like that, on all these different food items. Now, this is not the reason that there's an inflation problem in France. It's not because the grocery stores are gouging the people. It's because the European Central Bank gouged the people with money printing. That is why prices are going up. Christine Lagarde, Mario Draghi, particularly Draghi, because he was there for a lot longer, he kept saying that the problem in the Eurozone was that there wasn't enough inflation. His main goal as the head of the ECB was higher inflation. Well, he succeeded. The goal of the European Central Bank was for the cost of living to go up more because it wasn't rising enough, and that would include food. So the fact that food is more expensive is the consequence of a deliberate effort by the European Central Bank to increase prices, right? Well, they succeeded. And also, all of the budget deficits that are being run by the European governments, including the French government, which the ECB has been monetizing. So these supermarkets, they're not causing the inflation. They are responding to it. They are victims of it. In fact, many of these companies, and I own stock in quite a few of them, but a lot of these companies, even though they raised their prices, they didn't raise them enough. Their costs went up more. And the French politicians are now saying, hey, look, your input costs have been going down. Why aren't you cutting prices? Well, the reason is because they didn't raise them enough when the import costs were rising. In fact, initially, as costs started to go up, a lot of these companies were reluctant to raise prices. They thought it might be transitory. They didn't want to risk alienating their customers. And so they were behind the curve. And so now that some of the raw material costs are going down, you can't say, oh, we're going to immediately start cutting prices if we haven't even raised them enough based on how much their input cost already rose. But no, right? The politicians weren't mad at the supermarkets for not raising their prices when their costs went up. But now they're pissed off that they're not cutting them when their costs went down, even though they probably still haven't raised their prices enough to keep up with their costs. Their margins have suffered. I know that as a shareholder. But the reason I'm bringing up what's going on in France is because I think that's coming to a theater near us pretty soon. Because that's basically all they're going to have. When the price increases start to accelerate after the Fed has cut rates, right? What are they going to do? The Fed can't reverse and start hiking rates if it's just started cutting them. And so if the Fed is powerless to do anything about the resurgent inflation, that's going to leave it to Congress, to the president, who might do it by executive order. And what could he do by executive order? Well, I guess price controls. That's what I think Biden is going to do, especially if he's looking bad in the polls. If inflation is a big issue, how is he going to do anything about it? Well, he's going to try to order companies to stop hiking prices or reduce prices, just like France is doing it right now. And that may be the only way to help his chances of being reelected, especially if he thinks that the negative consequences of those price controls won't manifest until after the election. But, this whole idea, though, that you could weaponize the Justice Department and go after your political adversaries, this is very dangerous stuff, right? Even if, my theory on why they're doing it is correct, it's wrong. You can't use the Justice Department in this way. It is there to see that justice is served. It's not there to help reelect the person who happens to be president, but the whole process is corrupted.
You don't find the word you don't find the word democracy in the Declaration of Independence. You don't find the word democracy anywhere in the United States Constitution. And if the listeners want further convincing of this, when we talk about when we pledge allegiance to the flag, is it to the democracy for which it stands, or the republic, or the song during the War of 1861? It was the battle hymn of the democracy or the battle hymn of the republic.
It's going to be more spending this year than last year. So just get it out of your mind that there's any spending cuts actually happening. And the other issue was the U.S. ever defaulted? Boy, this was a lie they repeated about 1 million times, which you would get Yellen go on TV, you would get Biden go on there, and they would couch it in this moralistic stuff like, we're not a deadbeat nation, we always pay our debts, as if these people think that paying off your debts is somehow like really important. The ruling class never pays its debts. It gets someone else to pay it. That's why they always get bailed out by the central bank and by the taxpayers. But the reality is they have defaulted. Of course, they defaulted after the Revolutionary War, where they're like, oh yeah, we'll pay you back after like 10 years. But in the meantime, we won't make any payments. And then they renegotiated paybacks on like the Continental credits, all at, of course, much reduced rates, like, I don't know, like 60 cents on the dollar, that sort of thing. And then there was an 1862 default during the Civil War. And then the big one that everyone should remember was in 1934, after Roosevelt takes the U.S. off the gold standard, which of course was its own sort of default. He then tells people who had bought Liberty bonds during World War I, oh, we're not actually going to pay these back in accordance with the contract. The contract said we would pay you back in gold, or at least something that was directly convertible to gold. And instead, we're just going to give you this new paper money that we've created at this new random value of gold that we set. But if you're a domestic owner of those bonds, you can't even get that because only foreigners can get gold anymore. So it was just talk about being a deadbeat. You help give the government money to win World War I, and then they just decide, oh, yeah, we're not going to make good on that. So they have defaulted before, and they will default again at some point. And none of this is even counting the whole, hey, we're devaluing the currency, so we're paying back the debt in devalued dollars. So if once you count that, then it's clear to see that, yeah, there's nothing moral here in terms of paying back what's owed. The federal government has been a deadbeat. It is a deadbeat. It'll be a deadbeat again. So let's just stop acting like there's some sort of issue here about holding to our contracts and doing what we said we were going to do. To be lectured like this by Yellen and Biden is really just kind of embarrassing.
Well, I told Stockman that even as important as this issue is, I just can't bring myself to be interested in it anymore, because I've realized as I've gotten older that there really is no, present company accepted, like people listening right now, there really is no constituency for bringing our, quote, fiscal house in order. There really isn't. And if there is, it's not anywhere near as powerful as the we want to take your money constituency. We want checks with our names written on them constituency. That's way, way too big and powerful and entrenched. And so I kind of expect this outcome, which is why I don't find it interesting. And everybody, we get the drama queening all the time, every single time about doomsday scenarios that never come true. And that's it. And then we go right back to the way things were. I can't bring myself to care. I mean, who cares now?
Original abolished the FBI article. I looked at where does the FBI come from? And it was always this effort to really copy the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons were this private police force that did investigations of serious crime and crime rings and organized crime and all that sort of stuff. And they were called agents. And there's a reason FBI agents are called agents. It was an attempt to basically copy the Pinkertons and create this idea that they were these professional investigators, not police officers, and not even really part of the state somehow. And that then in the early 20th century became this whole idea of, oh, we're a more professional group. We wear suits and we're not beholden to the local police and party machinery. So there was an effort to villainize local politics and say the party machines, they all have corrupt cops, but we at the FBI, we are uncorrupted. We cannot be corrupted. So call us in and we'll solve your local crime problems. So that was always part of the messaging. But the reality, of course, is that they were never really necessary for crime fighting. So if what the country needs is some sort of agency that could help coordinate information among state agencies, that would be fine, but that doesn't necessitate any sort of federal police force. This was always a novelty that the Americans came up with, especially in a country that supposedly was composed of a bunch of sovereign states. So that's a 20th century invention. There's no authorization for it in the Constitution, of course. And it was horribly corrupt as soon as you started getting J. Edgar Hoover in there, who used it basically as a way to blackmail members of Congress so they would never cut his funding and do whatever he wanted. They, of course, tried to get Martin Luther King to commit suicide. They spied on people left and right. It's always been a horrible organization. But they ran such effective propaganda that it wasn't really until recently that conservatives were always falling all over themselves to tell you how great the FBI is and how great the CIA is, by the way. But one of Trump's many accidental virtues is that he's really just exposed the FBI for how partisan it is and how the FBI is all about protecting the FBI. And so now there starts to be some real division among conservatives and among Americans in general in terms of, is the FBI any good, or is it just there to spy on you, to go after its own personal enemies? And many people are starting to see the light on it, but we'll see how well that lasts into the future.
Now, the founders thought that the idea of majority rule was a form of tyranny. And if you look at the Constitution, if you read the Constitution represents our rules of the game, it's a very it's an anti-majoritarian document. That is, the president is not elected by a majority vote. The president can veto the wishes of 535 people of Congress, and it takes 2/3 to override his veto. So there are many anti-majoritarian aspects of the United States Constitution, which represents our rules of the game.
That the guy who opened the investigation into Donald Trump for reasons that have proved to be felonious is going to sit here and say, well, the big fear is that Trump could come back in and push bullshit investigations. Oh, all right. That's the worst thing we could end up with. And of course, he's very self-interested, as he says, I'm probably on the enemies list. I could be investigated if Trump comes back in. Now, all I can think is we could only get so lucky. And even if Donald Trump does become president again, I do not expect to see people locked in jail any more than we saw Hillary Clinton locked up after the 2016 win. But it was a pretty interesting, revealing little soundbite there. Any thoughts, Rob?
Yeah, well, I can't believe Comey is even allowed on television or amongst polite company. This guy should be a disgraced ex-FBI official who misused his office to help the Clinton campaign. And so for him to just decide to still get to go, hey, I'm the moral authority here, and let me tell you, Trump would be a rogue based on nothing other than my moral authority. Trump would be, who cares? You're literally a disgraced ex-FBI official. And then, as you already pointed out, for him to go, the worst thing he can do is use his office to run investigations of other people. In other words, the exact thing that you did. So the worst case scenario is he did what you did. I just don't even understand why mainstream media thinks that these are people that we should even be listening to their opinions. These people should be hiding in a hole. They're disgraced.
You know, when you think about Mitch McConnell and the fact that he wears a Ukraine flag lapel pin every day to the Senate, and that he said that the number one priority of the U.S. Senate is supporting Ukraine. Like, that's the number one priority of our elected officials. It is just important to remember how god-awful the Republican establishment is on this war. They're just horrible. And these are the people. And isn't it so funny that it's like all of the people who are like, you know, the whole media will freak out for being like so dangerous are the people who dare to maybe question this war. And yet all of the people who just want to just arm them to the teeth, those are all the people who the establishment of both the Republican and Democratic parties greatly prefer. Would be much happier having in power.
I hadn't sent this clip, but I saw it a couple days ago. Nikki Haley, I think, also had a CNN town hall, and she went off that the most important thing is making sure that we finish our work in Ukraine and that Russia doesn't see a victory. But you could see that the narrative is essentially, we're all in agreement that this Ukraine thing needs to keep going. Phil
Donahue got fired from his show on MSNBC because he was too hardcore against the war in Iraq. Noam Chomsky got drummed out of respectable left-wing circles because he was too hard on all of the wars. And Pat Buchanan gets drummed out. All the people who get drummed out. It always seems to be the common thing. There's vastly different views that they have on the economy, on all types of different domestic policies, on trade, on racial relations, on all types of different things. They have wildly different views. But the one common thread for all of these people who get kicked out of the respectable circles is that they're the ones who oppose the American war machine. That's the common thread that always gets you kicked out. Oh, you're not supporting these wars? Then you're out.
Any politician who would rigorously live up to his oath of office to uphold and defend the United States Constitution, he just would not get elected to office by the American people. Because what politicians reflect, they reflect the values and views of the American people, that is, those who will elect them to office. Now, some people might say, well, gee, Williams, that's a little bit strong. Well, look, we just might ask ourselves, what would happen to a politician who had the vision of, let's say, James Madison, the acknowledged father of the United States Constitution? And in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. And James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he says, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence." Now, if you look at the federal budget, 2/3 to 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. Now, just ask yourself, what would the American people do to a politician or to anybody running for office who would make a statement like Madison did?